Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Amen. If the first verse of today's reading from Mark sounds familiar, it's because you heard it 6 weeks ago on the first Sunday of Epiphany. On that Sunday, Mark's Gospel told the story of Jesus' baptism, ending when the Spirit descended like a dove, saying, "You are my Son, the Beloved. With you I am well pleased." Today's Gospel reading starts with that last uplifting verse from the first Sunday of Epiphany, and goes on with Jesus being abruptly driven into the wilderness. In one short sentence, the joy of Epiphany is washed away, like a bucket of ice water poured over the coach's head at the end of a football game. One has to admire the economy of words and the dramatic power of Mark's Gospel message. Look at the place where the Gospel writer says, the Spirit immediately drove Jesus into the wilderness. There was no time for goodbyes or congratulations. No stretch limo waiting at the curb. Jesus was driven by an urgent necessity, with no other choice being offered. He had to go to a place far from the comfort and distractions of friends and adoring crowds. A place where he had to confront Satan's temptations. I think the Spirit was driving Jesus into the wilderness because he was beloved. There was no time for celebration because Jesus had to face down Satan's temptations immediately in order to prepare for a new life and a new ministry. Lent was the time of preparation for Jesus' ministry to come, and the wilderness was the place. The wilderness is obviously an important symbol in the Bible. In fact, Bible scholars tell us that it appears almost 300 times in the good book. But what does the biblical wilderness symbolize? What's the metaphor? Sadly, my mind has been polluted by the picture of the fire swamp in the film The Princess Bride, where flames leap randomly out of the ground and ferocious animals lurk in the underbrush. I suppose we all have our own images. The COVID pandemic lockdown is certainly a prolonged wilderness for many of us. At any rate, the biblical scholars describe the wilderness as a place for intense experiences of isolation, of danger, and ultimately of divine deliverance, of renewal and of encounters with God. At first, it seemed contradictory to me for God to send his beloved Son into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. After all, temptation is bad, isn't it? Or is it? I think God sees good in the sort of learning that can come from confronting and overcoming temptation. The challenge for us is to learn the lessons that our own temptations can teach. And what better time than Lent? Nathaniel Herreshoff, the fabled yacht designer, often called the Wizard of Bristol, was a perfectionist who ruled his boat-building empire with an iron hand. Whenever this godlike figure saw a worker cutting corners or doing a sloppy job, he would scold the unfortunate person severely. When he was done, he'd ask, "Have you learned anything from your mistake?" Naturally, the worker would say yes, at which point Herreshoff would reply, "Good, then your mistake was worthwhile." Ideally, Lent is a time when I'm called, or maybe driven, to look at the painful mistakes that make me cringe, and learn from those mistakes in the process. By learning and changing, I can perhaps make something good out of something bad, like the worker in Captain Knapp's boatyard. But that's one of the troubles with Lent, as far as I'm concerned. Confronting my errors is hard enough, but changing my ways can be a lot harder. It's much more comfortable to just do without chocolate for 40 long days and stick with the familiar status quo. On the other hand, I know that being too comfortable can get in the way of change and stifle growth. Discomfort can be a message from God, a wake-up call, if you will. When I got out of college back in 1961, I went to work for a small engineering firm in Boston, which was working on part of a military satellite. Now, 60 years ago, a big satellite was the size of a basketball and ran on the equivalent of a couple of rechargeable flashlight batteries. The satellite we were working on, however, was 3 feet around, like a giant beach ball, and it ran on the equivalent of an automobile battery. In fact, it will be several years before the United States had a rocket big enough to get this behemoth into space. But the military, as usual, wanted to be prepared, so they were allowing plenty of time. In any case, that big battery was a challenge. Obviously, we couldn't steal one out of the boss's Pontiac and ship it off into orbit. So one of the major battery companies went to work developing one that would do the job. In a rarely seen miracle of engineering coordination, the prototype battery arrived, complete with a military escort, no less, just as our prototype system was ready to test. Naturally, we were excited. Opening the crate, we found a note along with the packing slip. The note informed us that this was one of only 2 batteries in existence, and that it cost, quote, a great deal of money. On the bottom of the sheet in bold face print were the words, "Do not damage this battery," with an exclamation point. That warning was not well received. After all, we were aerospace engineers, working with cutting-edge technology. We were going to evaluate the battery to make sure it worked. Sure, we might admire it, or maybe drool over it a bit, but we certainly didn't need a bunch of battery geeks to tell us not to damage their precious toy. Well, it took less than an hour for us to destroy that battery. And I mean destroy, as in a series of small explosions, bits of flying metal, and the release of unknown noxious fumes. If only we'd been more aware of our conceit and listened to the battery geeks' warning. I suspect that most of us have had similar experiences when our own pride and conceit has led to humbling catastrophe. Looking back, several lessons are obvious to me. First of all, telling an engineer not to break something is like telling a toddler not to pull the cat's tail. Thoughtless desire can be a trap. By being so absorbed in our own interests, we ignored the knowledge of those around us and missed the big picture. Speaking of big pictures, I still have no idea how the company's bigwigs dealt with our battery mishap. Finally, that battery disaster demonstrated how insidious temptation can be. We don't necessarily know we're being led astray. We certainly didn't mean to destroy the battery they have worked so hard to create. We were just too absorbed in our own desires and too sure of our own knowledge to properly value those battery geeks and their wisdom. We need others to keep our perspective. Jesus overcame Satan's temptation by staying connected to God. We may not have God at our elbow in the way Jesus did, but we do have God's disciples and the people around us. Think about those battery geeks, for example. We need to have the wisdom and the humility to recognize and celebrate the fact that our neighbors are also children of God. It's tempting, here's that word again, to think about Lent simply in terms of giving things up, as in no chocolate for 40 days. But I think what's really important isn't what we choose to give up, but what we choose to embrace. How are we tempted, and how do we overcome? Who are the people whose wisdoms we discount or ignore? Who are the battery geeks in our lives? I don't think God means for us to fail when we're tempted. Instead, he wants us to learn, to be made stronger, and emerge as better people. It may be a scary and unpleasant place, but deep down, we need the wilderness in order to learn and grow. Lent can be a time to recognize that God may let us struggle with our demons so that we can come to appreciate his love better. God may let us be frightened and worried so that we can come to know him as a source of solace. God may let us be weak so that we may know his strength. God reveals himself to us in the Lenten wilderness, if we look. Amen.